The city never slept, but for him, the night was the only time he could breathe. Behind the towering glass walls of his penthouse, he wasn't just a billionaire, he was a man with a secret, one that could destroy everything. The world saw power, success, a name that made headlines. But no one knew what lay beneath the surface. And that's exactly how he wanted it. Until she walked in. She wasn't supposed to be there. She wasn't supposed to mean anything. But from the moment their paths crossed, everything started to unravel. She was different, not blinded by wealth, not intimidated by who he was. Her eyes saw through him, past the headlines, past the power. And that terrified him, because if she got too close, she might uncover the truth. The one thing he had spent years hiding. She hadn't come looking for him. Life had thrown her into his world by accident, or maybe fate had played its hand. She was smart, relentless, and had a past of her own one she never talked about. But there was something about him that pulled her in, even when every instinct told her to stay away. He was a puzzle, a man who spoke in carefully chosen words, who never let his guard down. And yet, in the quiet moments, when he thought no one was watching, she saw glimpses of something real. The closer she got, the more the cracks began to show. He wasn't just hiding something, he was running from it. And in a world where power meant control, losing control was dangerous. For both of them. But she wasn't the type to walk away. She asked questions, pushed boundaries, and before either of them realized it, the game had changed. It wasn't just about the secret anymore. It was about them. About what was happening between them. About the way he looked at her when he thought she wouldn't notice. About the way she felt when he was near. But secrets don't stay buried forever. And in a city where everyone had something to lose, the truth had a way of finding its way to the surface. And when it did, nothing would ever be the same. The night was colder than usual, the kind that seeped through the cracks and settled in your bones. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the city lights flicker below. From up here, everything looked small, controlled. But control was slipping through his fingers, and for the first time in years, he wasn't sure how to stop it. She had been on his mind more than she should have been. He told himself it was just curiosity, that she was different in a way that unsettled him. But deep down, he knew better. She was a threat, not because she meant to be, but because she saw too much. He turned away from the glass, his expression unreadable. Across the room, his phone buzzed on the table. A message. He already knew who it was from before he picked it up. The same reminder he got every week. A warning. A ghost from the past that refused to stay buried. He deleted the message without reading it. It didn't matter. He knew what it said. Meanwhile, she sat in her small apartment, staring at the folder in front of her. She had spent the last few days trying to figure him out, but the deeper she dug, the more questions she had. On paper, he was perfect, too perfect. Every article, every business deal, every carefully crafted interview painted him as untouchable. A man who had built an empire from nothing. But there were gaps, things that didn't add up. People like him didn't come from nowhere. They didn't rise to the top without leaving something behind. She traced a finger over one of the documents, frowning. It wasn't just his success that intrigued her, it was what he was hiding. And something told her that whatever it was big. But why did she care? That was the part she couldn't figure out. She wasn't looking for trouble, yet trouble had a way of finding her. And now, she was in too deep to walk away. She closed the folder, pushing it aside. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. A message. Short. Direct. We need to talk. Her heart skipped a beat. She stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. It was from him. She stared at the message longer than she should have, her fingers hovering over the screen. 3 simple words, but they carried weight. A warning, a demand, or maybe something else entirely. She didn't know why she hesitated. Maybe because deep down, She knew that meeting him again would pull her further into whatever storm surrounded him. Her gut told her to walk away. But she had never been the type to listen. She typed out a quick reply and set the phone down, exhaling slowly. There was no turning back now. Later that evening, she found herself outside a quiet, upscale restaurant, not the kind that screamed wealth, but the kind where power was exchanged in hushed conversations over expensive wine, the kind of place he would choose. When she stepped inside, the warmth of the dim lighting contrasted with the sharp chill outside. He was already there, sitting in a corner booth, one hand resting on the table, the other wrapped around a glass. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. "You came." His voice was calm, steady. "You asked me to." He gestured to the seat across from him, and she slid in. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken words. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but it wasn't this. He looked the same sharp suit, composed, but there was something different in his eyes tonight. A flicker of something she couldn't quite place. "You've been looking into me." It wasn't a question. She met his gaze, refusing to look away. "Should I be worried?" His lips curved slightly, but it wasn't amusement. More like something edged with warning. "That depends on how deep you're planning to dig." She leaned forward slightly. "Why don't you just tell me what you don't want me to find?" A long pause. Then he sighed, setting his glass down. "Because some things are better left buried." She felt it then, the shift. The moment when a simple conversation turned into something else entirely. He wasn't just here to warn her. There was something he wasn't saying. "I don't believe in coincidences," she said. "And I don't think you do either. So why me? Why are you so worried about what I might find?" His jaw tightened. "Because I know what happens to people who get too close." The words sent a chill through her, but she held his gaze. "Is that a warning?" "It's a fact." She should have been afraid. Maybe part of her was. But more than that, she was intrigued. Because if he was trying this hard to keep something hidden, then it had to be big. And now, she had no choice but to find out the truth. She knew she should have walked away after that night. But something about the way he spoke, the way his eyes darkened when he warned her, only made her want to push further. She wasn't just curious anymore. She was invested. Days passed, and every time she tried to distract herself, the same thought returned. What was he hiding? And more importantly, why was he so desperate to keep it buried? She started noticing things. People watching her on the subway, outside her apartment, at the cafe where she usually worked. They were careful, subtle, but she wasn't imagining it. Every time she caught a glimpse of someone lingering too long, they would disappear the moment she turned her head. She wasn't paranoid. Something was happening. And he knew it. One evening, she found herself outside his building. She hadn't planned on coming, but her instincts led her here. The doorman recognized her and let her up without a word. As she stepped into his penthouse, she expected the same unreadable expression, the same guarded tone. But tonight was different. He was standing by the window, shoulders tense, phone in hand. When he turned, she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Fear. She closed the door behind her. "What's going on?" He hesitated, then exhaled sharply. "You've been followed." Her pulse quickened. "I know." His gaze hardened. "Then why are you here?" "Because I think you have answers." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration flashing across his face. "You don't get it. This isn't a game. The people watching you, they don't give second chances." She swallowed hard, but she didn't back down. "Then tell me what I'm up against." Silence stretched between them. Then finally, he moved closer, lowering his voice. "Years ago, I made a mistake. A deal that should have never happened. I thought I was in control. I wasn't." She felt a shiver crawl down her spine. "Who are they?" His jaw tightened. "The kind of people who don't forgive. She should have felt regret for getting involved, for digging too deep. But she didn't. Instead, adrenaline rushed through her. Because now, the pieces were coming together. He wasn't just hiding something personal, he was running from something much bigger. And if they were watching her, it meant they thought she was a threat too. A sudden noise shattered the silence. A phone buzzing loudly on the table. He picked it up, his expression darkening as he read the message. "They know you're here." Her breath caught in her throat. "What do we do?" He looked at her for a long moment, then said the last thing she expected. "We run." She barely had time to process his words before he was already moving. He grabbed his coat, checked his phone again, then turned to her with an urgency that sent a chill through her. This was real. The danger wasn't some distant threat, it was here, closing in fast. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice lower now, more controlled. "They won't come through the front. Too many cameras. But they're watching, waiting for us to make a move." Her pulse pounded as she followed him toward the back exit of the penthouse. Every instinct screamed at her to ask more questions, to demand answers, but now wasn't the time. Right now, survival was the only thing that mattered. They stepped into the elevator, the air thick with tension. As the doors slid shut, she finally found her voice. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere safe." His answer was clipped, but there was something else in his tone, something that told her even he wasn't entirely sure what was coming next. The elevator doors opened into a private underground garage. He led her to a sleek black car, unlocking it with a quick tap. The second she was inside, he pulled out onto the dimly lit street, keeping his speed just under suspicious. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The city blurred past in streaks of neon and shadow, but she barely noticed. Instead, she watched him, his jaw tight, fingers gripping the wheel harder than necessary. This wasn't just about her digging too deep. This was bigger. She turned toward him. "Tell me the truth. Who are these people?" His hands tightened around the wheel. "They don't have a name. At least, not one you can look up." "That's not an answer." He exhaled sharply, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror, before he finally spoke again. "They built me." She frowned. "What?" "Everything I have, everything I've built, none of it was supposed to be mine. I was just a face, a name they could control. But I walked away." Her stomach twisted, and they didn't like that. "They don't let people walk away," he said, his voice quieter now. "They let you think you're free. They let you build your life. Then, when you least expect it, they remind you who's really in control." The weight of his words settled over her, heavier than anything she could have imagined. This wasn't just a dangerous deal or a business rivalry. This was something else entirely. She glanced at the mirror, her breath catching. "We're being followed." He didn't react, but she saw the way his fingers flexed against the wheel. "I know." A beat of silence. Then, before she could say another word, he took a sharp turn down a dark alley, tires screeching. Her heart slammed against her ribs as he accelerated, weaving through the empty streets like he had done this before. The headlights behind them grew closer. She gripped the edge of her seat. "Tell me you have a plan." For the first time that night, she saw something flicker in his eyes. "I do. But you're not going to like it." She didn't have time to argue before he made his move. In one swift motion, he cut the wheel hard, sending the car skidding through another narrow alley. The tires screamed against the pavement, and for a split second, she thought they might lose control. But he was too precise, too practiced. This wasn't the first time he had run from them. The headlights behind them swerved, struggling to keep up. But they weren't giving up. They never did. She clenched her fists. "Whatever your plan is, now's the time." He didn't respond. Instead, he pressed a button on the dashboard, and suddenly, the alley wasn't so dark anymore. A set of steel doors ahead of them slid open just in time for him to floor the gas and drive straight inside. Before she could even process what had just happened, the doors slammed shut behind them, locking out the world. Her breathing was sharp, her pulse erratic. "Where are we?" He finally turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Safe. For now." She looked around. The space was massive, cold, industrial, filled with old monitors and equipment covered in dust. It wasn't just a hideout. It was a bunker. "You had this place ready," she said slowly, realization sinking in. "You knew this was coming." "I knew it was only a matter of time," he admitted. "They don't chase unless they plan to finish it." She exhaled, trying to steady herself. "Then what happens next?" He hesitated, then pulled a small flash drive from his pocket. "This." Her eyes narrowed. "What's on it?" "The truth." Something in his voice made her shiver. He wasn't just running from them. He had something they wanted, something they were willing to kill for. She took a slow step forward. "So you didn't just leave them. You stole from them." He held her gaze. "I took proof." The weight of it all crashed down on her. This wasn't just about him anymore. It never had been. The people chasing them weren't after revenge. They were after control. And as long as that proof existed, they couldn't let him walk away. She swallowed hard. "If you have evidence, why not expose them?" He glanced at the monitors, at the dust-covered equipment that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. "Because exposing them isn't as easy as you think. This isn't just about one deal or one crime. They have their hands in everything: politics, corporations, entire governments." She shook her head. "So what's the plan? Keep running?" "No," he said quietly. "I stop running." She froze. "What does that mean?" Before he could answer, a sudden noise echoed through the bunker. A sharp beep. A signal. His entire body tensed. Then, he reached for a small device on the table, his jaw tightening as he read the screen. Her stomach dropped. "What?" He slowly lifted his eyes to meet hers. "They found us." Before she could react, the bunker's lights flickered. Then, a low hum filled the space, the sound of power shifting, of systems being overridden. The steel doors they had just sealed shut groaned as something on the other side began to force them open. Her heart pounded. "You said this place was safe." "I thought it was." His voice was calm, but she saw it, the flicker of something he rarely let slip. Fear. She stepped closer. "Then tell me, there's still a way out." His lips parted, but before he could speak, the doors gave way with a violent screech. And then, everything went dark. The darkness was suffocating. For a brief moment, all she could hear was her own breath, shallow and uneven. Then came the sound of boots, steady, deliberate. They were inside. He grabbed her wrist, pulling her back toward the far end of the bunker. His grip was firm, but not forceful, just enough to make her move without hesitation. "Stay close," he whispered. The emergency lights flickered to life, bathing the space in a dim red glow. It wasn't much, but it was enough to see the shadows moving toward them. They had no time. She felt him reach for something, a switch, hidden in the metal wall. A faint click, and suddenly a panel slid open, revealing a narrow passageway. Without a word, he pulled her inside, sealing the door behind them just as the first gunshot shattered the air. She flinched, but he didn't stop moving. The passage was tight, barely wide enough for them to move side by side. She could hear his breathing, steady but controlled. Even now, even with everything crashing down around them, he wasn't panicking. "How far does this go?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Far enough." The sound of shouting echoed behind them, but the walls muffled the voices. They still had time, but not much. She didn't know how long they moved through the tunnel, only that each step felt heavier than the last. Finally, they reached another door. He pressed his hand against a scanner, and with a soft hiss, it slid open, revealing a dark alleyway. Fresh air hit her lungs like a shock. They were out, but they weren't safe. He led her toward a car parked a few feet away. Not the sleek luxury vehicle he had driven before. This one was nondescript, old but well-maintained. A getaway car, prepped for moments like this. They got in, and before she could say anything, he started the engine and pulled out onto the empty street. Her hands were shaking. She clenched them into fists. What now? His gaze stayed on the road, his jaw tight. We end this. She let out a short, breathless laugh, more from disbelief than amusement. And how exactly do we do that? He reached into his pocket and pulled out the flash drive. By making sure the world sees this before they can stop us. She stared at the small device. Something so tiny, yet it held enough power to bring everything crumbling down. They'll come after us harder, she said. You know that, right? I do. She looked at him, really looked at him. He wasn't the same man she had met weeks ago, the one who seemed untouchable, invincible. Now, he was just a man trying to outrun his past. And for some reason, she was running with him. The night blurred as they drove, the city stretching endlessly ahead. He had a plan, he always did, but this time, so much more was at stake. By morning, the truth would be out. And whatever happened next, there would be no going back.